I mean, one little question I had about your initial presentation was, you said the Brexit effect on the economy was much less than predicted, less than COVID. But of course, those are figures before a lot of aspects of Brexit, had even come into force.
No, that's absolutely right, Gavin. I remember Chu Enlai, the great Chinese leader, was once asked, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" And he said, "Well, it's too early to tell."
Yeah.
And that's the case with Brexit. We need to be probably at 2030 before we can fully examine all of this. And one of the advantages of that is because COVID is now on the decline, still with us, but we're managing it much better. A decline in COVID will take away the impact of that particular pandemic, hopefully, so we can see what the Brexit effect is separately if we look at it. And so it won't be until probably another 10 years before we can understand the full effects. That would be my guess. And at the moment, we can't really separate these out. But my feeling is, looking at the evidence, the pandemic is a much bigger problem right now than Brexit was.
Is there a way of modelling what would have happened if COVID hadn't happened?
That's a very good question. There's a whole, in the methodological literature, there's a whole new movement called counterfactual causal analysis. And actually some of the modelers use this. And it works roughly like this. It tries to replicate an experiment of the kind that scientists would do in a laboratory. You can't do that for countries, of course, but you can try. And what they do is they create what is called a synthetic country. Rather bizarre idea. And the synthetic country has got the closest attributes to Britain that you can devise. Similar population, similar standards of living, and you can combine these all together into one synthetic country. Now, the one difference between the synthetic country and Britain is the synthetic country was never a member of the EU. An example of this, one of the countries involved in this modelling is actually New Zealand, but there's others too. And you can see how Britain does compared with New Zealand, and they reach conclusions to the effect that if we hadn't left the EU, we would be more prosperous. But needless to say, this kind of modelling is controversial. A lot of people think it's, oh, well, I quite like the idea, and it's very welcome to try to do experiments on an international scale of this kind, or approximate them. But you have to remain skeptical about whether or not this is true. And particularly, I mentioned earlier, the ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council, program on Britain, UK and a changing Europe. Yep. They have some economists who've modeled this, and they use these techniques, and they come to the conclusion, that we've lost a lot of ground. But you've got to buy the approach to be sure. And I'm a bit skeptical. I'd like it to be true, but I'm not sure.
I think some of the academics at the University of Surrey are involved in that, which is where I used to work.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Yes, and
so I think some of them did that.
There's people at Warwick who've done this, and and I welcome any new methodological techniques, but you've got to convince a lot of people that this isn't really the same as doing a laboratory experiment in a petri dish.
Yes, I can imagine. But yeah, interesting. I hadn't realised it was quite. It could do that, but yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Richard Jones has put a question in the chat because his microphone is not working apparently. given the length of time you expect rejoining to take, what sort of issues should European pro-European campaigners be raising? What should we pursue with people and with politicians?
I think the main thing is to keep the issue alive, and that's a modest kind of goal, but it's essential. Issues can drop completely off the agenda and be forgotten unless there's support among non-governmental organizations, charities, and organizations such as yours, that raises the issue repeatedly and says, go along to a meeting of your candidates in the general election and ask them about it. Keep the issue alive till the circumstances under which it can be taken seriously emerge. And the first step, of course, is rebuilding trust with the European Union, which has been badly damaged, as you all know. If you can do that, rebuild trust, then you can start raising the and I think that's the way to look at it. But it's it's a march using the long road, as it were. It's not going to be something that's going to be catapulted to the top of the agenda in the coming general election. Probably not in the subsequent one, which will be in 2028, using the usual lists. So we're talking about the late part of this decade to keep the thing alive until it can get back into public consciousness, and the public might be persuaded then. And the old concerns about the turmoil and the arguments have been forgotten, or at least put in the background. Nobody expected, when David Cameron called the referendum, that it would be so much turmoil following it. And so a lot of leaders, politicians, are very wary about referendums and so on. But give it 5 up to 10 years and maybe they'll look again.
Oh, and Chris has got a follow-up. He's asking about what about young people's views?
Oh, yeah, that's an optimistic source of the future of Remain, because young people, for the most part, are Remainers rather than Brexiters. It's oldies who are the Brexiters. There's an age dimension. I didn't put it in the details in the presentation, but it's certainly true. And you have a process of generational replacement going on, in which young people grow older, but not necessarily change their mind on this. If they were Remainers when they first became interested in politics, around the ages of 15 to 20 or so, they may well remain Remainers in the future, and that would increase the numbers over time. It's a slow process, but it's called cohort replacement, one of the things that happens in social science. The other one, which is much better known, is what they call life cycle effects. That's the idea that as people get older, they get more conservative. It's actually not really true. The cohort replacement, new generations coming along, is more important than the life cycle effects if you model this properly. So I think that's a source of optimism for those who want, to try to get back in a few years' time.
I was going to mention the generational change as well, but I do think there are other factors that you shouldn't be forgotten. And I know it's seen a little bit like sour grapes now, but at the time, if you think about the fact that, apart from the fact that the young people were not given a say and that there was no second referendum, which a lot of Leave supporters had said in advance, including Rees-Mogg, that there ought to be a second referendum once the terms were known. Because the second point I would make is that the campaign was fraudulent in many respects, in some cases illegal, but certainly a lot of people voted Leave on the clear assurance that we were going to stay in the single market, because a lot of a lot of the Leave campaigners said that. They said we just want to leave the institutions. We don't want to leave the single market, and we don't want to leave the customs union. And that was said repeatedly throughout the Leave campaign. The third thing was the fact that the Remain campaign was a disaster. But it's not entirely surprising, given that there'd been no reason over the preceding 25 years to have any pro-European agenda, because we were in Europe and it was taken for granted that we were in Europe. The whole Northern Ireland settlement was based on the fact we were in Europe. So the fact that the Leave campaign, relentlessly supported by a majority of the media over the 25-year period with UKIP and all its predecessors, inevitably skewed the referendum. And in the end, it was only expected to be a consultative referendum. And for a change to have taken place that affected so many people's lives on a 52-48 majority was a travesty of any constitutional principle as well. There should have been a clear 60% requirement for that to happen. And I would argue that there's a strong case, whether it can be made politically or not, another matter for holding a further referendum, making it quite clear that we would have to have a 60% majority in favour of even applying to rejoin, or even entering into negotiations for rejoining, in order for us to proceed. Because if you think, one last point then is to say, if you think back to the original Edward Heath application to join the EU, there was a lot of opposition at the time because it was change. People don't want change. And Wilson, even then, he got his majority, but boy, did he have to campaign for it to get his referendum agreed that we should stay in Europe. So I just wondered why, my own feeling is that those factors alone are sufficient to be optimistic about the fact that this matter can be raised before 2030 or whenever the next but one election is going to be. And you say keep it alive. I would say we need to do more than keep it alive. We need to keep on campaigning and getting those opinion surveys produced, looking at the results of Brexit, like freedom of movement and the border controls, Northern Ireland, the effect on specific sectors like fisheries and agriculture. All these things, I think they if we highlight these points, we can bring this matter up to the front of the political agenda again a lot sooner.
I agree. If one keeps the issue alive, you have to be optimistic. You do. And there are some things that could make you optimistic. But the further away we are from the turmoil that occurred between 2016 and 2019 or 20, the better, because people are really, they were really upset by that. And one of the arguments of the opponents of another referendum will be, we don't want to go through that again. And in fact, if you look carefully at the polling in Scotland, there's a consistent majority who don't want independence. There's a large number who do, but there's a consistent majority. And if you probe their views, it's partly that they're fed up with all the fighting and infighting that went on, with the clash between the SNP and Westminster. And they want a more cooperative relationship and so on. And they don't think that's going to be possible if there's a big breach. So I think keep the flame alive by all means, and you have to be optimistic. And there are reasons to be optimistic. But I think you'll find if you raise this, go to a public meeting in your local constituency and ask the candidates about this, they'll all dodge it.
Jayant whose microphone is still not working, had a follow-up to John's question. What domestic political and electoral reforms would the EU expect the UK to make before even contemplating readmitting us?
Electoral reform is strictly a national thing. The EU doesn't take a position on this. You've got to have this system or that system, except for elections to the European Parliament. They do on that. And if you recall, the first time there was a vote for the European Parliament back in the 70s, we had the first past the post system, but we had to change it when we were members. And they introduced a common PR system across Europe, a very good idea. And but the EU does not make rules about national elections. It avoids that for obvious reasons. It's an extremely, it's an extremely controversial thing. Suppose there was not a majority Labour administration elected in 2024, but Labour was the largest party, and the Lib Dems got 20 to 30 seats. You might have a coalition. Lib Dems could then argue for a change in the electoral system.
Yeah.
And Labour would be a great deal more sympathetic to that than the Conservatives were in 2011 when there was the last referendum on that. So it might be possible for a campaign run by a coalition to get support for this. But the problem is, and we saw this in the original referendum, people often don't understand the details of electoral systems. It's a big concern to some, but it's a minority taste, and they'll ask questions about how's this going to change my life and so on. You've got to, a referendum is a very blunt instrument. We seem to have evolved a constitutional requirement that if we went back into the EU, we'd have to have a referendum on that. And also, if we change the electoral system for Westminster, we'd have to have a referendum on that. The British Constitution is eternally dynamic, changing all the time. So precedent plays a big role. But it looks like if you want to change the electoral system, you're going to have a referendum, and you're going to have a lot of parties supporting it, other than, I suppose, the Conservatives would oppose it.
And we had a question in the chat from somebody whose microphone isn't working. So the question was whether the vote in Wales was skewed by the number of English people resident in Wales.
That's a very interesting question. And I think to some extent that's true. If you look over the last few years, well, say since the referendum in Scotland on independence back in 2014, the SNP have been very dominant in Scotland. But Plaid Cymru is not dominant in Wales. It's got representation and it's got votes, but it's way behind the SNP. And part of the reason for that, not the only reason, but part of the reason is a lot of English people live in Wales, and they tended to be in a bit more Brexit, some of them. And you got an overall result in Wales, and it was partly low turnout in the referendum. You got an overall result, which was copying England, but part of that was people living in Wales who were Brexiters. That said, not all Welsh are Remainers. People who are poor, and there's quite a lot of poverty in Wales, felt the same way, that somehow Brexit was going to liberate them, and maybe Johnson was going to level up, and so on and so forth. So it's not all about, just the English.
How do you feel about the impact of programs such as Erasmus Plus as a result of us leaving the EU, and those of us who obviously want to rejoin? What is our best tactic for trying to get that back onto the agenda?
Well, I think the campaign by academics and others, indeed, to rejoin the European grant system, which has been successful, was a model of what to do in relation to that, arguing that the number of students coming from the EU has fallen quite a bit. Some universities relied a lot on them, and this needs to be driven home as part of the university lobbying, into the system. And they can say that they've had a success, even with a very Eurosceptic government. More or less everybody who are strong Brexit Conservative MPs think it's a good idea to share grants and Britain to apply to the European system. So why not extend that to students as well? Indeed, the two are related. So I think build on the success of the campaign to get us back into the European grants network, and try to make that into something about more students should come here. And as we know, a lot of universities are in some difficulty financially and relied on European students. So there's an argument that the Treasury might just be interested in, namely, we can help deal with the financial problems that some universities have got by recruiting more Europeans.
But the European students on Erasmus aren't the fee-paying ones. They're the ones who don't pay fees. So I don't see how you can make that argument.
Well, I think Erasmus and more general recruitment are correlated. When the Erasmus system worked, we saw it at my university. I'd get students, I taught the first year courses, and I'd get students from all over Europe, and they would go back, and I'd keep in touch, and they'd say, oh yeah, I'm talking to my friends about how you should go to Britain. Even if you don't get an Erasmus, you should do that. So I think they're not independent of each other, is what I'm trying to say. And if you can get a feeling that this is a good thing, and you can provide some scholarships to kind of provide seed corn for it, I think it will help with that.
I'd just like to comment on some views, my question about what about the young. Our Star is doing a tour of Britain, and we held an event with a junior panel, and that was through a link with a local school. And there were 11 panelists, age range 14 up to 18. 7.5 of them would vote immediately to join the EU. Their comments covered the 5 points of the Star, and it was an amazingly interesting and well researched by the pupils event. It's very positive, and I think we really got to get the young more involved. I travelled to continent on Friday, and there was a group of a girls' school going for a day trip. I always wear an EU beret, and 3 comments: I like your hat, or I like your beret. And then I explained that I was the chair of East Kent, etc. So I think we must be visible in everyday life, and I do that all the time. We also went to collect the Star. Can I recommend that by going to Brussels and visiting the Museum of European History and the Parliamentarium, I came away even more pro-EU. I mean, it is actually fantastic visiting those places. Finally, every autumn, there is the NRM March, the National Rejoin March. And I think that keeps us going. That is, keep going until we join. You mentioned being optimistic. I agree, but I think that we should be campaigning pro-EU and not anti-Brexit. And that way it's a positive, forward-looking thought, because just look at the facts of the EU and what it offers in the way of unified thinking, policies for citizens, which is certainly not the impression I get from the present government. And those were just comments to add to the discussion.
No, I think you're spot on with that. I think there is clear evidence, as saying earlier, that young people are more likely to want to rejoin, remain, and so on, than older people. And in addition, one of the reasons, I suppose, is that they like the idea of traveling, easily, without all the aggravation you can get if you are outside. So that's, I think, a very positive thing. And it is important to keep the issue alive. If I'm wrong and Brexit turns out to be much worse than I was saying earlier, and we'll know that in 4 or 5 years, the opportunity for bringing the issue up again and getting support is there. It really is. And so one of the usually in elections, the economy is always one of the big issues, usually at the top, but very often very close to the top. So if you can make the case that Brexit is leaving us behind quite clearly, I think that would be a very positive message that a lot of people would resonate with a lot of people. And given that a lot of Brexiters in the Red Wall at the moment, if you read the polling, feel very betrayed by what they were told in 2019, then they may look again.
I've got a question from Gianta, which kind of ties into the last thing you said. So she asks, will Brexit regain salience as an issue as the inability of our economy to perform to potential outside of a major economic bloc becomes apparent?
Yes. There was a very interesting book produced by after the 1975 referendum, which, as you will recall, was about Britain staying in, and 2/3 roughly voted to stay in and a third out. David Butler was one of the authors, the guru, election guru, who died a year or two ago. And one of the key themes of that book was Britain was being left behind economically compared with Europe. And at the time, this was true. If you look at the growth rates and prosperity rates in Europe, the main core members, because of course the EU at that time was the common market, much smaller, their growth was way ahead of Britain's. And there was a lot of talk about Britain being the sick man of Europe and so on. If you got into that situation again, where it was quite clear that European economies were doing well and we weren't, you could reignite that argument. It resonated with a lot of people in 1975. We need to be a member of this because we're being left behind, and look at their economies, they're leaping ahead and we're not. And that would be a strong argument, I think, were it to come about. But at the moment, unfortunately, the European economies aren't, they've been badly affected by all the things that we've talked about. And so that's not really true at the moment. Britain's sort of in the middle when it comes to growth rates of EU countries. But if you saw a diversion emerging, then that argument was very powerful in 1975 and could be again.